I taste it in my throat. Some of the last words Christopher Young uttered as he was given a lethal injection.
Young spent 12 years on death row for shooting and killing an East Side convenience store owner in 2004. And tonight, Young became the 8th prisoner put to death this year in Texas.
And I've been a gang member all my life. And so I'm like on a collision course for death out there and not caring. I think that if I wouldn't have never came to death row, I wouldn't be the individual I am today. I wouldn't be as mature. I wouldn't be able to explain to my daughter's life, like the appreciation of it, because I didn't have any appreciation for life.
Time can feel infinite until the moment it runs out. Imagine sitting alone, counting the hours, the choices you've made weighing heavier with every tick of the clock. In one cell, a man faced the consequences of a lifetime in a single day, knowing the world outside had moved on, while he remained trapped in the echo of his own past. What you are about to see is a story of transformation and tragedy, a case that challenges the limits of justice and the possibility of redemption. This story is rooted in real events, unfolding over more than a decade, and it leaves no simple answers. Before we begin, a note to our viewers. This case contains mature themes and situations that some may find intense. Please take a moment to ensure you are comfortable proceeding. If you are new here, welcome to The Last Verdict. We explore true crime cases with a focus on depth, nuance, and human complexity. Subscribe to join this community, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. To those who have been with us, your support has helped this channel grow, spreading awareness and understanding of real cases through your shares, likes, and engagement. Your contributions allow us to continue telling stories that matter. In this episode, we will examine the life of Christopher Young, tracing a timeline that begins long before the events that brought him to death row, exploring the choices, circumstances, and pivotal moments that defined his path. We will follow the investigation, the legal proceedings, and the final chapters of his life. The timeline of this story is structured to give you a complete understanding. We start with his early life and the influences that shaped him, move through the events leading to the crime, follow the aftermath and legal process, and conclude with the final moments before his execution. Each chapter builds on the previous one, revealing insights into both the individual and the system that judged him. On a quiet Sunday morning in San Antonio, Texas, the city began to wake up. The sun filtered through the dusty windows of a small convenience store, the kind that's tucked away in a neighborhood where everyone knows each other. Behind the counter was Hasmukh Patel, a 55-year-old father, husband, and local shopkeeper. A man who, like so many immigrants, had come to America with hopes of a better future for his family. The morning was just beginning to settle into a rhythm when the door opened. A man entered, young, disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from a night of drinking and drug use. Christopher Young, 21 years old, stumbled into the store, his mind clouded by a mix of alcohol and the remnants of a chaotic life. He was in a haze, lost in a world of confusion and regret. What happened next was sudden. No warning, no demands. Just a man carrying with him the weight of his past, a past that would soon collide with this peaceful morning. The door closed behind him, and the world outside seemed to fade away as tension filled the air. Hasmukh Patel, ever the calm and composed figure, raised his hands. His voice was steady, asking the young man to put down the weapon he hadn't yet shown. There was no fear in his voice, no panic, just a quiet plea for peace. But then something shifted. Something irreversible. Christopher Young's trembling hand tightened, and the world inside the store would never be the same. The calm morning shattered in an instant. The aftermath was swift, and the consequences of that moment would ripple far beyond that store. But the true tragedy wasn't just in the loss of a life. It was in the loss of so many potential lives. Hasmukh Patel wasn't just a victim of a random act. He was a man who had lived a life of hard work, dedication, and love for his family. He had built something from nothing, creating a space in his community where trust and routine were valued. a small, quiet corner of the world, disrupted in one tragic moment. In those few seconds, a family lost their father, their protector, their foundation. Hasmukh's children, his wife, and his community were left reeling from the loss of someone who had given so much for others. It wasn't just the end of a life. It was the end of a legacy. A man's dream, his family's future, stolen by one moment of poor judgment. As for Christopher Young, the reality of what had just transpired quickly set in. In the immediate aftermath, he wasn't thinking of his future or the consequences of his actions. No, instead he was lost, disoriented and confused. The weight of the moment seemed to press down on him as he stumbled away from the scene, almost as if his body was trying to escape the horror that his mind was struggling to comprehend. He sat outside on the curb, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't thinking about the money. He hadn't even taken anything from the store. What he did was not about the robbery. It was about something deeper, darker, something that had been festering for years. But that wasn't something the authorities cared to examine. Not yet. They saw the evidence. A confession, surveillance footage, a clear suspect. But what happened inside that store, what led to that violent moment, wasn't just about a man committing a crime. It was about a life in turmoil, a fractured soul that had been pushed to the edge by years of trauma, addiction, and pain. Christopher Young's actions were the product of a life lived on the edge, lost in a cycle he couldn't escape. What he left behind was more than just a crime scene. It was the end of a peaceful morning, and the beginning of a long journey through the justice system that would ultimately define his life. Christopher Young's life was marked by hardship from the very beginning. Born into a world where stability was fleeting, he was just 8 years old when his father was murdered. The tragedy didn't just steal a man from a family, it shattered a sense of security, leaving a young boy with no guidance, no protector. Without his father, Christopher was thrust into a world of uncertainty, where survival often meant looking for comfort in the wrong places. By the time he was a teenager, the streets had become both his refuge and his prison. The neighborhood around him wasn't a place of hope. It was a place where danger lurked around every corner, and the only protection came from being part of something bigger. For Christopher, that something was the gang culture. It didn't matter that he had potential. It didn't matter that he had intelligence. The streets, with all their chaos, had already begun to claim him, and they didn't give him the time to find a different path. Yet, there were moments, flickers of a brighter future, that showed who Christopher could have been. He was a smart kid, sharp in school, and gifted in ways that his environment could never nurture. He had an ear for music and the ability to play instruments with a natural ease. He was the kid who could ace a math test but would often choose to disappear into the background rather than stand out. He could have been a composer, a scholar, a man whose talents could have led him to a life beyond the streets. But the pain of losing his father and the relentless pull of the streets weighed too heavily on him. Christopher's story is one of lost potential. In a world that didn't offer him the tools to cope with his trauma, he found solace in a gang. The camaraderie, the feeling of belonging, these were things that a young boy, scarred by loss, desperately craved. But with that sense of belonging came a price. It wasn't long before he became entangled in the violence and the lifestyle that gangs brought, each day further removing him from the bright future he could have had. The turning point came early. By the age of 15, Christopher had already been arrested multiple times, his life becoming a cycle of arrests, juvenile detention centers, and constant exposure to violence. The boy who could have been a scholar, who once had the world at his fingertips, was now a product of his environment. Every misstep, every wrong turn pulled him deeper into a life he could no longer escape from. It was clear that the choices he made were fueled by more than just rebellion. They were rooted in years of pain and trauma, and when Christopher finally took the life of another, it was the culmination of years of pent-up anger, confusion, and the misguided belief that this was the only life he could live. Would you have made a different choice if you were Christopher Young? Take a moment and ask yourself, how many of us are one traumatic event away from becoming something we never intended to be? This case is a reminder of how fragile our futures can be, and how the lack of support, love, and guidance can turn someone's potential into a dark reality. If this story is affecting you, make sure to subscribe now. Don't wait. Join us and follow the rest of the journey into this tragic case. You don't want to miss what's next. And for those who won't subscribe, go ahead and tell us why. Enter the comments and let us know why you wouldn't want to be part of a community that's telling the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it gets. Don't let the weight of this case slip by without understanding it fully. Now, let's move forward. Christopher's path was about to take a turn that would seal his fate forever. On November 21st, 2004, Hasmukh Patel opened his small convenience store in San Antonio, Texas, just as he did every morning. A father, a husband, a man who worked tirelessly to provide for his family, Patel was a familiar and comforting presence in his neighborhood. But that morning, a dark cloud loomed over the store, one that would change everything in the blink of an eye. Christopher Young, high on drugs and alcohol, walked into the store with a weapon tucked under his jacket. His mind was clouded by confusion, frustration, and the remnants of a troubled life. He wasn't thinking clearly. His judgment was clouded by the intoxicants racing through his veins. What started as a simple moment of confrontation escalated quickly. Young did not demand money. He did not threaten Patel in the way one might expect in a robbery. Instead, his emotions, likely a mix of anger, fear, and deep confusion, took control. Patel, seeing the desperation in Young's eyes, did what many would. He attempted to defuse the situation. His voice was calm as he raised his hands, trying to reassure the young man, to bring some sense of peace to the chaos that had entered the store. But the moment became irreversible. In an instant, a single action sealed a tragic fate. Young fired the weapon, and the life of Hasmukh Patel was taken. The confusion that clouded his judgment instantly became regret. Regret for an action that could never be undone, for a life that was now lost. In the aftermath, Young stumbled outside. His mind was overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. He didn't know what he had just done. He was disoriented and lost, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. He sat on the curb, drenched in sweat, shaking, his mind struggling to process the chaos he had caused. It didn't take long for the police to find him. He was arrested not far from the scene, still in a daze, unable to comprehend the magnitude of his actions. His confession came quickly, filled with regret and remorse. He explained that he hadn't even remembered pulling the trigger. The words were hollow, the remorse sincere, but the reality was clear. The damage was done, and a man's life was forever altered. For the Patel family, the impact was catastrophic. Hasmukh's wife was left without a husband. His children were left without a father. A community that had known and trusted Patel was left reeling from the loss. What had been a quiet, peaceful morning turned into a day that would haunt them all. In the wake of the tragedy, there was a ripple effect that touched many lives. Hasmukh's family was left to navigate the aftermath of a life taken too soon, while Young's life was thrust into a new, darker chapter. The pain of his actions weighed on him, but the reality was that the legal system would have the final say. His remorse would not change the fact that a man had lost his life, and a family was left shattered. The loss of Hasmukh Patel wasn't just a crime, it was a turning point. It shattered lives, changed futures, and set in motion a legal and moral battle that would continue long after the events of that fateful morning. On the morning of November 21st, 2004, Hasmukh Patel stood behind the counter of his small convenience store, a familiar and comforting presence to the locals of San Antonio. It was a quiet Sunday morning, nothing out of the ordinary. But within the span of a few minutes, his life, along with the lives of countless others, would be forever altered. Christopher Young, just 21 years old, walked into the store in a haze of intoxication. He had been drinking heavily and using drugs for days, his mind clouded by confusion, anger, and a deep sense of despair. Young wasn't planning a robbery in the traditional sense. There were no demands for money, no threat of violence to force the store owner into submission. He was lost, trapped in a spiral of destructive choices and emotions he couldn't control. As he entered, Patel recognized something was wrong. The young man was agitated, his eyes wild with uncertainty. In a calm, measured voice, Patel attempted to ease the tension, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. He said nothing more than a few words in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. But in that moment, something shifted in Young. Perhaps it was the haze of drugs and alcohol, or perhaps it was something deeper, a long history of unresolved anger, frustration, and despair. The young man raised his weapon, and without warning, the quiet morning turned to chaos. A single shot was fired. Young immediately left the store, his head spinning. He didn't flee quickly. He was slow, disoriented, unsure of what he had just done. The weight of the action hit him only moments later. He was no longer just a young man trying to navigate a life spiraling out of control. He had just taken a life. Minutes later, law enforcement arrived at the scene, where they found Young not far from the store, sitting on the curb. He was drenched in sweat, his body shaking as the reality of what he had done began to set in. He was not running from the crime. He was lost in the confusion of it all. The police took him into custody. During his interrogation, Young's emotional state was one of disbelief. He confessed to the crime, his voice laced with guilt and sorrow. He explained that he hadn't meant to kill anyone, that he didn't even fully remember pulling the trigger. But the evidence was clear. The crime was done, and there was no turning back. In that moment of surrender, Young expressed deep regret, not only for the life lost, but for the irreparable damage his actions had caused. The impact on Hasmukh Patel's family was devastating. His wife, a woman who had shared decades of her life with him, was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered future. His children, who had looked to their father for guidance and love, were left without the one constant in their lives. The Patel family was forever altered by that senseless act, but the ripple effects didn't end there. The loss of Hasmukh was felt throughout the community. People who had trusted him, relied on him, suddenly found themselves grappling with the harsh reality that one man's life had been violently taken. And it all began with the unraveling of one young man's life. This was not just a simple robbery gone wrong. It was a tragic, catastrophic event born of years of trauma, addiction, and deep-rooted pain. In the blink of an eye, Christopher Young's life was altered, and so was the life of an innocent man whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What began as an attempt at robbery quickly escalated into something far darker, something that left an indelible mark on everyone involved. This was no longer just a crime. It was the turning point for both the victim and the perpetrator. In that split second, both their fates were sealed. When Christopher Young was sentenced to death, he was sent to Texas's notorious Polinsky unit, a place where the walls are thick with silence, and the isolation can swallow even the strongest minds. His first days on death row were a stark contrast to what he had imagined prison to be. Young had expected chaos, violent encounters, gang wars, and the constant pressure of survival. But instead, he found himself alone in a small, solitary cell for 23 hours a day. The world outside faded, and the reality of his new life settled in. This wasn't just a prison. It was a cage for his mind, as much as his body. At first, the silence was unbearable. The loneliness pressed down on him, and the weight of his crime sat like a stone in his chest. He shouted at the walls, punched the steel door, and tried everything he could to escape the endless cycle of thoughts that consumed him. He was trapped, not just by the physical bars, but by the psychological torment of his past, his guilt, and his remorse. But in the depths of that isolation, something unexpected began to shift within him. Young started to reflect, not just on the crime he had committed, but on his entire life. With no distractions and no escape, he had no choice but to face the raw, painful truths of his past. It was during these quiet moments of self-reflection that a turning point came. He began to question the life he had lived, the choices he had made, and whether there was still a way for him to make some form of amends. One day, a fellow inmate, Reginald Blandon, passed him a book. It wasn't the kind of book Young expected. It wasn't about survival or street life. Instead, it was a philosophical text, As a Man Thinketh by James Allen. The words were simple but profound, and they resonated with him in a way that nothing had before. The idea that our thoughts shape our destiny, that our inner world determines our actions, struck him deeply. This was the beginning of Jung's transformation. He became a student of his own mind, questioning his patterns, his beliefs, and his anger. He began reading more books, seeking out works that challenged him, that made him think critically about his life and his place in the world. As time passed, Jung found purpose in his new role as a mentor to other inmates. He wasn't just locked in his cell anymore. He was engaged with the other men on death row. He helped de-escalate violent situations, offering words of peace where there had once been threats of violence. He intervened during moments of intense conflict, talking men down from the brink of violence, preventing assaults, and even stopping a suicide attempt. His actions didn't go unnoticed. Guards, fellow inmates, and staff began to see a different side of Christopher Jung. He wasn't just the same angry young man who had walked into the store years ago. He had become someone else, someone who sought to calm the storm, not just survive it. But despite this transformation, there was a tension in the air. Jung's redemption came too late. His actions in prison, his growth, and his change in mindset couldn't undo the fact that his crime was still there, still looming over him. Christopher Jung's journey on death row was one of inner peace, not of freedom, but of self-awareness. He found redemption in a place meant to destroy him, learning how to live in a way that was radically different from the man he had been. And though it came too late to save him from the system, his transformation was real, and it was undeniable. For those of you who have followed this journey, who have witnessed the depth of Jung's change, ask yourself, how many others out there still have a chance to change, but never get the opportunity? How many lives are we willing to write off believing redemption is beyond reach? If you believe in the power of second chances, if you understand the complexity of human life and growth, subscribe now. Don't wait to regret it later. This is a story that proves change is possible, if we're willing to see it. And for those who won't subscribe, let us know why. Let's hear why this story, and the lessons within it, aren't worth your time. After years on death row, Christopher Jung's fate seemed sealed. But as the years passed, something shifted in him. His remorse deepened, and his transformation became undeniable. Jung was no longer the angry young man who had walked into that convenience store all those years ago. He had become a model prisoner, one who mentored others, intervened in violent situations, and worked tirelessly to prevent future tragedies. But even as he made strides towards redemption, he found himself facing an unrelenting system that refused to recognize his change. Jung's lawyers filed clemency petitions, urging the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles to consider his personal transformation. They argued that he had grown, that he had become someone who not only deserved to live, but who could contribute to society in ways that no one had anticipated. His case became a symbol of the larger flaws within the justice system, particularly when it came to race. The case highlighted the racial disparities inherent in the Texas death penalty system. Jung's legal team pointed to the case of Thomas Bart Whitaker, a white man who had been granted clemency despite committing a far more horrific crime. Whitaker had murdered his entire family, except for his father, who survived the attack. His sentence was commuted to life in prison, a decision that sparked outrage due to the stark differences in the way the justice system treated white defendants compared to their black counterparts. Jung's team argued that his sentence should also be reconsidered, pointing to the biases that influenced his case. But no matter how compelling the argument, no matter how much evidence there was of Jung's transformation, the clemency request was denied. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles rejected his plea for mercy, and the system, cold, indifferent, and unmoving, refused to consider the man Jung had become. The system's refusal to acknowledge his change felt like a statement in itself. Once you were convicted, you were forever defined by that moment. Amid this battle, the Patel family, who had been torn apart by Jung's actions, began to show an unexpected depth of compassion. Hasmukh Patel's son, Mitesh, publicly forgave Young. He expressed that, despite the pain his family had suffered, he didn't believe that death was the answer. Mitesh pleaded for Young's life, a gesture of mercy that showed the complexity of human emotion, how grief, forgiveness, and justice could all collide in unexpected ways. Yet despite Mitesh's plea, the cold bureaucracy of the justice system pressed forward without hesitation. The system didn't care about mercy, it cared only about punishment. For Young, the fight was more than just about his own life. It was about the future he wanted for his daughters, the life he wished he could provide for them, even from behind bars. He fought not only for his own survival, but for the possibility that his daughters might grow up knowing a father who had changed, a father who had learned from his mistakes, who had transformed into someone capable of love, empathy, and guidance. But in the end, the system didn't care about the future he was trying to build. It didn't care about the man he had become. Young's last hope wasn't just for himself. It was for his daughters, his future. But in the end, the system couldn't care less about his transformation or the family he had left behind. The cold, impersonal legal structure he fought against had no room for redemption, no room for growth. It had room only for punishment. Christopher Young's path to redemption was one that sought to challenge not only the moral weight of his crime, but also the flaws of a system that had long since passed judgment. After years of demonstrating a significant transformation behind bars, Young sought clemency. His attorneys filed petition after petition, hoping for a second chance, a chance to prove that the man who had been on death row for over a decade was no longer the same person who committed that crime in 2004. His clemency request, however, wasn't just about his own redemption. It was about something bigger: racial fairness within the Texas death penalty system. Young's legal team pointed out the stark racial disparities in the way clemency was applied in Texas. They noted that, in cases similar to his, white defendants had received life sentences or clemency, while black defendants like Young were often met with an unwavering push towards execution. This wasn't just a battle for his life. It was a fight against a system that had shown, time and time again, that race played a significant role in who lived and who died. They also argued that Young's crime was not the product of an inherent evil, but of years of deep trauma, addiction, and environmental factors, none of which had been properly considered in his original trial. His transformation in prison was testament to the potential for change, for redemption, but the system was unwilling to listen. Young's clemency requests were met with the same coldness as the system that had sentenced him. But amid this legal battle, there was one voice that stood in sharp contrast to the impersonal machinery of the state: Mitesh Patel, the son of Hasmukh Patel, the man Young had killed. Mitesh's plea for clemency was a powerful moment that carried immense emotional weight. Despite the loss of his father, Mitesh found the capacity to forgive Christopher Young. He spoke out publicly, urging the state of Texas to spare Young's life. For Mitesh, the act of forgiveness wasn't just an act of mercy. It was a call for justice that went beyond the legal system's cold verdict. He believed Young had changed, that the man in front of him was not the same person who had committed the crime. This was a man who had suffered immeasurably, yet he found it within himself to plead for mercy for his father's killer, something that many thought was impossible. Mitesh's forgiveness stood as a powerful counterpoint to the unyielding pursuit of vengeance that the state was so determined to enforce. But despite his emotional plea and his display of empathy, the system remained unmoved. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, in a decision that shocked many, unanimously rejected Young's request for clemency. The bureaucracy of the system, cold and unfeeling, refused to acknowledge the transformation that had taken place. It didn't matter that Young had worked to mentor other inmates, to stop violent confrontations, or to contribute positively in any way he could. It didn't matter that Mitesh Patel, the victim's son, had asked for mercy. What mattered was a system that viewed Young's past actions as the defining characteristic of who he was, unwilling to see him as anything more than the crime he had committed over a decade ago. Young's last hope wasn't just for himself, it was for his daughters. for the possibility that they might grow up with a father, even if that father was locked away in prison. But in the end, the system couldn't care less about his transformation or the family he had left behind. It cared only about its own cold process, a machine that ground on regardless of human emotion or the complexities of personal change. The gap between public opinion and the unyielding legal process could not have been more apparent. The public, many of whom had witnessed Young's change, had called for mercy. The system, however, had made its decision long before, and no amount of forgiveness or transformation could undo that verdict. The battle for clemency, ultimately, was a microcosm of a greater systemic failure, a justice system that, despite its flaws and inconsistencies, was unable to accommodate the possibility of real change. It wasn't just a loss for Christopher Young. It was a failure of the system to evolve, to embrace the complexity of human life, and to allow for the potential of redemption to ever take root. The clock ticked down, and the reality of Christopher Young's final hours on death row was inescapable. The sterile, oppressive silence of his solitary confinement now felt even heavier as the hours moved toward the inevitable. He had been in this place for years, waiting, hoping, reflecting on what could have been. But as the countdown began, it was clear that the hope he had clung to for so long would not be realized. The day of his execution, July 17, 2018, began like any other. But for Christopher Young, it was different. This was no ordinary morning. It was his last. The finality of it all weighed on him, pulling his thoughts in many directions. In the quiet of his cell, he had time to reflect on the life he had lived, the choices he had made, and the lives he had affected. Not just the one he had taken, but the ripple effect of his actions. As the hours passed, he was served his last meal, standard prison fare, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, corn, and a slice of bread. It wasn't a special request. It was the food he had come to expect during his years of incarceration. For someone about to face death, it seemed almost insignificant. But as he sat, eating slowly, there was a certain heaviness to the moment. Each bite was a reminder that this would be the last meal he ever had. His mind wandered, but there was no escaping the reality. This was the final chapter. As the day wore on, Young's emotional state shifted. He had, in many ways, come to terms with his fate. There were no outbursts, no cries for mercy, no last-minute pleas for freedom. Instead, he was resigned, reflective, accepting of the consequences of his actions. His thoughts, however, weren't just on himself. They were on his family, particularly his daughters. He had spent years behind bars, trying to transform into a man they could be proud of, and yet, his transformation had come too late. The system had already made its decision, and it would not be swayed. In the hours leading up to the execution, Young was allowed to make a final statement, a chance to say something before his life was taken. As he was strapped to the gurney, surrounded by witnesses, officials, journalists, and family members of the victim, he spoke. His final words were brief, but powerful. He expressed his remorse, not just for his crime, but for the pain he had caused others. "I hope my death serves some purpose," he said quietly. "Make sure the kids in the world know I'm being executed, and those kids I've been mentoring keep this fight going." His words weren't about himself. They were about the future, about the lessons that he hoped others could learn from his mistakes. In those final moments, it was clear that his remorse was not just a plea for forgiveness, but a plea for change that he could no longer be part of but hoped others could take up. As the drugs began to flow, Young's body began to shut down. The witnesses, including family members of Hasmukh Patel, stood behind the glass, their emotions a complex mix of grief, anger, and, perhaps for some, a sense of justice. The pain of losing a loved one could never be erased by an execution, and yet for those present, it was the culmination of a journey through a broken system that had claimed not one life, but many. Christopher Young's last breath came quietly. His chest stilled, and in that moment his transformation, the man he had tried to become, was overshadowed by the weight of the crime he had committed. The system had decided long ago, and in the end, that decision was final. Young's death marked the end of a long journey, but it left behind an indelible question. Was justice truly served? Or was it simply the end of a story that could have been rewritten if only the system had allowed for the possibility of change? As we reflect on the life of Christopher Young, we are faced with a question that goes beyond the specifics of his crime. Was redemption ever truly possible for him? Was it fair to execute a man who, by all accounts, had shown significant personal growth during his years behind bars? Young's transformation, which included mentoring fellow inmates, preventing violence, and working toward peace, is undeniable. It raises an uncomfortable but necessary question. If someone demonstrates genuine remorse and changes their ways, should they still face the ultimate punishment? Redemption isn't just a word, it's a process. And yet, in a system that measures justice by retribution rather than rehabilitation, can anyone truly be redeemed? Christopher Young's case forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that our justice system isn't always built to allow for growth or change. The cold, unyielding nature of the death penalty system is one that doesn't account for the complexity of human beings. It demands an eye for an eye, often without room for reflection, forgiveness, or second chances. But at what cost? If we are quick to impose finality, do we risk losing something more profound? The possibility of healing, both for the offender and for society at large. The bigger picture here isn't just about one man or one crime. It's about the larger systemic issues at play. Racial bias in the death penalty system has long been a controversial issue in the United States, particularly in states like Texas, where disparities are hard to ignore. Young's case highlights the unequal treatment of black defendants, especially when compared to their white counterparts, who often receive life sentences rather than execution. His story is one among many where race, class, and background determine the fate of those who find themselves trapped in the criminal justice system. Furthermore, the death penalty itself raises serious ethical and moral questions. Can it ever be justified, knowing that it eliminates the possibility of redemption or rehabilitation? Does it truly serve justice? Or is it simply an outdated form of retribution that doesn't fit with a society that claims to value second chances and human dignity? These are questions that deserve to be discussed, questioned, and reconsidered. And it is up to all of us to ask whether the system we rely on is truly capable of fair and just outcomes, or whether it needs to be reevaluated to better account for the complexities of human life. As you consider the case of Christopher Young, I encourage you to think critically about the system and its implications. Do you believe justice was truly served in this case? Or do you think the system failed to acknowledge the possibility of change? What is justice, and who deserves a second chance? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your perspective on this case, the death penalty, and the concept of redemption. And if you're interested in more thought-provoking true crime content that challenges the boundaries of justice, subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue to explore these critical issues, share stories that matter, and foster meaningful conversations around the complexities of our criminal justice system. Thank you once again for being part of The Last Verdict.